The rain was coming down hard, washing over the streets as if it were trying to cleanse the filth from this place. But nothing could wash away what I was about to do. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from rage. The metallic taste of blood still lingered in my mouth. I couldn't tell if it was mine or his. The suspect was on his knees, coughing, eyes wide open, silently begging for his life. I stared at him, every muscle in my body ready to strike again, even though I knew he was already beaten. In the distance, the faint wail of a siren mixed with the deafening thud of my own heartbeat, and that's when I realized I had crossed the line. For a moment, I wasn't the cop who swore to uphold the law. I was just a man consumed by hate, one step away from becoming exactly what I've spent my life fighting against. And in that instant, as the weight of my gun seemed to pull my hand toward the final shot, a voice shouted behind me and changed everything. My name is Daniel Brooks. I'm 39 years old, 19 of those wearing this badge. I grew up in a small town in rural Kansas, where everyone knew each other's name, and where I learned early that justice wasn't just a pretty word you heard in church on Sundays. It was something that had to be defended, even when it hurt. My father was the sheriff, a hard man, almost incapable of smiling, but he believed a cop couldn't afford to make mistakes. He used to say, "One slip can cost a life, and a lost life never comes back." I grew up with that phrase carved into me, like a vow I thought would guide me forever. But adulthood has a cruel way of testing the promises we make when we're young. At the start of my career, I was an idealist. I believed that arresting criminals was enough, that the system would take care of the rest. But over time, I realized the justice I dreamed of and the justice that actually existed were two very different things. I saw convicted killers walk free for lack of sufficient evidence. I saw drug dealers laugh in my face in court, certain they'd be back on the streets in days. I saw victims beg for protection and get nothing but silence in return. Every time it happened, something inside me eroded. It wasn't just frustration. It was like small cracks forming, letting my patience, my faith, and especially my belief that following every rule was always the right thing slip away. Outside of work, my life didn't remain untouched either. I married young, thinking I could balance family and duty, but police work doesn't forgive. Long nights, emergency calls in the middle of birthdays and holidays, coming home with the smell of gunpowder and blood. None of that goes well with stability. My wife, Rachel, tried to understand, tried to stay, but one day she simply packed her bags and left, taking our 8-year-old daughter with her. Now I see my little girl twice a month, and every goodbye is a painful reminder that what I protect on the streets is exactly what I couldn't protect at home. That loneliness, mixed with patrolling neighborhoods where life is worth less than a cheap watch, becomes a slow poison. You start to harden. At first, it's just a protective shell. Then, without noticing, the shell starts swallowing who you really are. I began to see faces and stories as case files, not people. I started measuring my days by the number of arrests, not by the smiles I saved. Until one day, I realized I could no longer answer the simplest question of all. Why did I start doing this? Still, no matter what life threw at me, I never stopped believing there was a line I would never cross, an invisible boundary that separated a cop from a criminal. I'd seen colleagues step over it, and I swore it would never happen to me. I was the man who kept his cool, who stayed in control even when the blood boiled, the man my father believed I should be. But the truth is, in recent months, something had started to change. The anger I'd locked away for years began finding cracks to escape. Unresolved cases, repeat offenders, faces that kept coming back into my orbit as if mocking my powerlessness. It all piled up. It wasn't one single event that broke me. It was the slow, constant wear. One drop after another until the glass overflowed. And when that call came over the radio that night, I was already at my limit. I didn't know it yet, but that night would put me face to face with the darkest version of myself, and the choice I'd make would forever change the man I thought I was. The night was stifling, the kind of heat that clings to your skin and makes the air feel heavy. My partner Mike Harris and I were wrapping up a long patrol, cruising down nearly empty streets, when the radio crackled with that metallic voice that always brings bad news. All units be advised. Possible break-in in progress. 1120 48th Street. Suspect armed. Prior history of extreme violence. Requesting immediate response. The message came. Loaded with urgency, and before I could even respond, I felt that familiar chill run down my spine. The address wasn't unfamiliar, and not for good reasons. 1120 sat on a block we'd answered to more than a dozen times before. Drugs, assaults, domestic violence, even a homicide once. It was one of those houses that seemed to carry its own history, as if the wood in the walls was already steeped in the scent of blood and gunpowder. As soon as I heard the call, something in my chest tightened. It wasn't just the seriousness of the incident. It was the name that popped up on the automatic report on the cruiser's dashboard. Raymond Cole. Cole was a familiar face, and not the kind you're happy to see. Cold, calculating, with a rap sheet that seemed to grow by the week. The kind of man who looked at you and didn't see a cop, just a temporary obstacle. I'd arrested him twice before. Twice he walked free. The first time for lack of sufficient evidence. The second because a key witness changed their mind. Everyone knew Cole had a way of intimidating anyone who dared to speak against him. And now, according to dispatch, he'd broken into the home of a former business associate, and things had turned ugly. As Mike sped up, red and blue lights slicing through the darkness, my pulse quickened. The dispatcher's voice returned over the radio. Unit 27 be advised. Possible victim injured inside. Multiple neighbors reporting screams and sounds of struggle. Suspect may be under the AC. Influence of substances. That changed everything. An aggressor under the influence, especially Cole, was a ticking time bomb. Flashes from the past began to surface in my mind. I remembered a case 2 years earlier when we'd arrived too late to a scene like this. The victim, a young woman, lay on the floor while the attacker stood over her, hands covered in blood, like he owned the moment. I remembered the smell, the heavy silence after the screaming stopped, and the nights I couldn't sleep, replaying the what-ifs. I wouldn't let that happen again. Mike tried to break the tension with a joke, like he always did, but even he didn't believe his own voice. I just kept staring out the window, the streets flying past, my mind already mapping out what we might find inside. Doors kicked in, shouting, an armed suspect ready to explode. And deep down, a darker part of me wondered if this time I'd stop him for good. No more arrests, no more releases. 2 blocks away, the radio flared again. Unit 12 reports visual of suspect entering armed. Unit 27, priority 1. Mike pushed the speed even further, and my whole body shifted into that state of heightened awareness. Firm grip on the weapon, steady breathing, the internal quiet that comes right before the storm. As we turned the last corner, I saw the house. The lights were off, but the curtains swayed with the warm night breeze, revealing fleeting shadows inside. A neighbor, sweaty and frantic, waved us down on the sidewalk, pointing at the front door. Then came a muffled, sharp sound that rolled down the street. I didn't need to see it to know. Gunfire inside. This was the point of no return. Crossing that gate, I knew this wouldn't just be another call. That night would decide if I was still a man who upheld the law, or if I was about to become judge, jury, and executioner. The cruiser screeched to a stop, the sharp sound of the brakes slicing through the thick, humid night air. I was out of the car. Before it had even come to a complete halt, feeling the sticky heat rise from the asphalt and cling to my skin. The wind carried a heavy mix of sweat, gunpowder, and something else. That unmistakable metallic scent that only hangs in the air when blood has already been spilled. The street was nearly deserted, except for 2 neighbors standing frozen in the distance, caught somewhere between curiosity and fear. The house loomed ahead, still and silent, like a predator lying in wait. The facade was worn, the paint peeling, heavy curtains blocking any view of the inside. The lights were off, save for a faint flicker coming from the hallway, the kind of stuttering glow from a bulb on its last breath. The iron gate stood ajar, crooked, as if it had been kicked. On the front door, clear signs of forced entry. As I moved closer, Every step seemed to amplify the surrounding sounds. First, the faint hum of a distant power line. Then, a muffled noise from inside, like furniture being dragged, or someone stumbling. And then a scream. Short, choked, cut off far too soon. Mike was right behind me, weapon in hand, his breathing heavy, eyes scanning every shadow. We exchanged a glance. Slow, silent approach, but ready to strike. The sidewalk was sprinkled with shards of glass. Looking up, I saw the second-floor window had been shattered, jagged pieces still clinging to the frame. The dirty, torn curtains swayed outward in the warm night breeze. I tried to picture whether it was an escape, route, or the trace of a violent entry. When my hand closed around the doorknob, it was cold and damp, like it had just been gripped by nervous hands moments earlier. The door was cracked open, and from inside came a stale mix of cheap cigarettes, alcohol, and the unmistakable scent of tension, cold sweat hanging in the air. I drew a deep breath, forcing back the ghosts that always come in these moments, and took the first step inside. The narrow hallway swallowed me like the throat of a tunnel. The floorboards groaned under my boots, each sound feeling too loud. The walls were yellowed from years of smoke, scattered with small dark stains, the kind that told stories no one wanted to hear. Farther down, a weak light flickered, stretching and shrinking shadows as if they were alive. On the floor, a broken glass lay in a spreading puddle, liquid still running slowly across the wood. Against one wall, a fallen picture frame displayed an old photograph of two men smiling for the camera. One of them was a younger, cleaner-looking Raymond Cole. The other was a face I didn't know yet, but I was sure he was part of the reason for tonight. A sudden noise snapped me back. Quick footsteps coming from the room to the left. Mike and I locked eyes. No words needed. We were already in the wolf's den. My breathing grew shorter, sweat trailing down my neck, my finger resting against the trigger. Then I heard something I wasn't expecting. Heavy, uneven breathing, like someone was, crying or trying to hold back sobs. I couldn't see who it was. Just a hunched shadow cast against the wall, motionless. My heart pounded so loudly it echoed in the hallway. This was the moment where training demanded calm, but I could feel the rules starting to slip. And then, from deep within the house, a voice, low, rough, laced with hate, cut through the air. "You shouldn't be here, Brooks." It wasn't just a threat. It was a personal reminder that, tonight, nothing would be simple, and I might not be ready for what came next. The sound of my breathing felt louder than the noise around me, and for a moment, the entire world shrank to that narrow hallway and the echo of Raymond Cole's voice rumbling in my head. Mike was to my left, low stance, weapon raised, eyes locked ahead. The tension was so thick it felt like it was pressing down on my shoulders. I moved first, slow, measured steps, but each inch forward felt like moving closer to a point I couldn't come back from. We entered the main room. The lights flickered, casting warped shadows across the stained walls. A couch lay overturned, a table smashed, and in the corner, a man was tied to a chair, head slumped forward, breathing unevenly. His shirt was soaked in blood. I couldn't tell if it was his own or someone else's. The air carried the heavy stench of fresh violence, gunpowder, sweat, alcohol, and fear. Then Cole stepped out of the shadows as if he'd been waiting for me. He held a pistol in his right hand and a knife in his left, the blade still dripping. His eyes had that look I knew too well, not just rage, but enjoyment in having control. "Put the gun down, Brooks," he said, like it was a casual conversation. "You don't want the old man here to have a quick end, do you?" Mike tried to maneuver for a better angle, but Cole was quick. He yanked the hostage forward, using him as a shield, pressing the knife against his throat. I knew that if I rushed him, the cut would come before I could react. And deep down, I knew Cole wanted exactly that, to force me into an impulsive move. The radio on my shoulder crackled, but I switched it off in one swift motion. I didn't want distractions, didn't want outside voices telling me what to do. That room, in that moment, was its own sealed world. Just me, Mike, Cole, and the man in the chair. "You think the law's going to save you from me?" Cole kept going, a smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. "How many times have you put me away? How many times have I walked free? Tonight's different. Tonight, you lose." His words poured gasoline on the fire already burning inside me. I felt the heat rising, the anger I'd kept caged for years starting to slip free. Cole shoved the hostage to the ground and stepped toward me, gun raised, smirk unshaken. Our eyes locked for less than a second, but it was enough to set everything in motion. Mike shouted, "Drop the gun!" And then the first shot tore through the air. The bullet whizzed past my shoulder and punched into the wall behind me. I fired back, 2 rounds, aimed low to avoid the hostage. Cole staggered, knocking over a shelf that crashed down, spilling books and shards of glass across the floor. The noise jolted the hostage awake. He began crawling across the carpet, groaning. Mike moved in from the left, trying to cut Cole off, but Cole kicked a chair toward him and bolted down the hallway toward the back of the house. His footsteps thudded against the floor, punctuated by the crash of objects he was knocking over to slow us down. We chased him. Every room we passed was chaos. Furniture overturned, drawers dumped out, dark stains on the floor that weren't just dirt. It was as if this place had been staged for a fight, like Cole had known I'd come for him eventually. In the kitchen, he stopped briefly, turning to fire again. The bullet splintered a cabinet, wood fragments flying. I ducked and pressed forward, heart hammering. Every step was driven by more than duty now. This had become personal. Then he made his mistake. He turned toward the back door, not realizing Mike was already there, blocking his escape. The 3 of us froze for a breathless moment, guns raised, lungs burning. There was no surrender in Cole's eyes. I knew he'd rather die than be cuffed again. When he shifted to fire, time seemed to slow. His finger tightened on the trigger, his gaze locked on me, blood pounding in my ears. And I knew this night was about to force me to choose. Between the law I swore to uphold and the justice my heart was screaming for. It was in the split second when Cole's gaze flicked away, not because he let his guard down, he never would, but because I caught sight of something behind him that froze my blood. A side door, half open, revealed a small room dimly lit by the weak glow of a desk lamp. And there, sitting on the floor, hands tied and a deep gash on his forehead, was Ethan, my nephew. The shock hit so hard I forgot where I was, for a moment. Ethan was 19, my younger sister's son, a kid who'd grown up seeing me as a hero, who once told me he dreamed of joining the police academy. The last time I saw him was 2 months ago, when I took him out to lunch and he mentioned thinking about moving to another city. Never, not in my worst imaginings, did I think he'd somehow end up in Raymond Cole's orbit. "Ethan?" The word slipped from my mouth before I could stop it. Cole smiled. That slow, calculated grin of his, the kind that said he'd just pulled the pin on a grenade and was waiting to watch it go off. "So you know the kid. Makes this a lot more fun." My heart pounded. Seeing him there, face battered, eyes red, hit me like a knife. But there was more. Ethan's expression wasn't just fear. It was shame. He looked away, as if hiding something. And then Cole, savoring the moment, decided to drop the truth I didn't want to hear. "Your nephew's no innocent victim, Brooks. He came to me. Thought he could make some quick cash. He just didn't understand that in my world, debts get paid." His words landed like body blows, each one heavier than the last. I didn't want to believe it, but a part of me, the part that's seen too many young men lose their way, knew it could be true. How many good kids had I seen seduced by easy money and the fake glamour of a criminal life? Ethan tried to speak, but Cole kicked the door shut with a sharp thud, like he was saving that scene for later. Now this wasn't just another call. It was personal, deep, an open wound. I could feel the anger rising inside me, mixing with a raw pain that threatened to rip away every ounce of control I had left. "Come on, Brooks. Show me how far you'll go to save your own blood," Cole taunted, lowering his gun slightly as if giving me space to make my move. He wanted this fight. He wanted to drag me down to his level. Mike looked at me, trying to understand what was happening, but my head was already somewhere else, between duty and family, between the law and vengeance. And the worst part, A voice deep inside was whispering that maybe this time, the law wouldn't be enough. Cole stepped back into the hallway, daring me to follow. I knew if I went after him, there'd be gunfire. I also knew that every second I hesitated could cost Ethan his life. But in that moment, I realized something even more dangerous. I wanted Cole to give me a reason. I wanted him to make a move so I could end this right there. That was the most dangerous discovery of the night. Not just that my nephew was tangled up in all this, but that I was standing one step away from no longer being a cop and becoming exactly the kind of man I've spent my life hunting. I could feel the sweat running down the back of my neck, but it wasn't just from the suffocating heat inside that house. It was because, inside me, two versions of who I am were at war. The first, forged from years of training, discipline, and my father's hard lessons, was shouting at me to keep a cool head, follow protocol, take Cole down, and walk out with everyone alive. The second was raw, primal, driven by the image of Ethan tied up, injured, too ashamed to even look at me. That voice didn't want handcuffs. It wanted to end this right here. I'd always believed there was a limit, a line that no matter how bad things got, a cop had to stop at. But tonight, that line felt blurred, almost erased. All I could think about was my nephew's face. The possibility that he was involved in this mess, and the certainty that if Cole walked out of here alive, he'd find a way to destroy what was left of my family. My mind began building excuses for what I was starting to feel. If he fires, it's self-defense. If he threatens Ethan again, I have no choice. If he runs armed, the protocol has my back. Each justification brought with it a strange sense of relief, like I was already preparing myself to cross the line and trying to convince myself it was inevitable. While I fought that battle in my head, seconds felt like hours. Old cases flashed before me, the victims I couldn't save, the faces I'd never see smile again. I remembered the day my father looked me in the eye and said, "Anger is a poison, son. It kills you before it kills your enemy." I understood what he meant, but right now, that poison had a strangely sweet taste. Mike noticed something was wrong. "Brooks, breathe. Listen to me. Don't do something you can't take. Back." His voice was steady, but it sounded far away. I heard him, but it was like there was glass between us. My focus was locked on Cole, who still wore that provoking smile, the kind you only see on someone who knows they're inside your head, shaking your balance. Ethan was just a few yards away, locked behind that door. I could imagine his breathing, the fear of not knowing if the uncle who'd always meant safety was about to turn into something completely different. That thought crushed me and fueled my rage at the same time. Deep down, I knew this was the moment that would define everything. If I acted hot-headed, if I let anger steer my hand, there'd be no going back. It wouldn't matter how many years of clean service I had, how many lives I'd saved. That one act would erase it all. But another thought, equally dangerous, kept gnawing at me. What if this was my only chance to stop Cole for good? How many times had I seen him slip through justice's fingers? How many more? Innocence would he hurt if I let him live? Wouldn't ending it here be an act of protection? That internal fight was like holding a gun with two hands, one pulling the trigger, the other trying to push it back. And with each second that passed, the hand wanting to shoot felt stronger. I could hear my own heartbeat, heavy, marking the rhythm of the choice I had to make. In that instant, I realized it wasn't just about Cole or even about Ethan. It was about me, about who I was, and about who I was on the verge of becoming. And the question pounding in my head wasn't, what should I do? But if I do it, will I be able to live with myself afterward? Cole took a step back, his eyes locked on mine, as if he could read every thought racing through my head. He knew I was at my breaking point, knew that the smallest spark could set everything ablaze. The silence between us was suffocating, broken only by the distant drip of a leaking pipe somewhere in the kitchen and the sound of Mike's steady breathing behind me. The weak light flickered, casting twisted shadows across our faces, and for a moment, It didn't feel like there was a criminal and a cop in that room, but two predators, each ready to make the final move. His gun was still raised, but the barrel lowered slightly as if he were giving me room to choose my path. The provocation was hanging in the air. "Come on, Brooks. Show me you're just like me." Those words cut deep, and I felt the weight of my own breathing. One step. That was all that separated us. One step and one quick move, and I could end this. But how would I end it? As a cop or as an executioner? My eyes darted to the door of the room where Ethan was being held. I couldn't see his face, but I knew he could hear everything. I knew he was waiting to see which version of his uncle would emerge. The one who always preached about honor and control, or the one who acted without thinking of the consequences. My finger rested firmly on the trigger, the cold metal a cruel reminder that this choice would be final. My mind, noisy as it was, had narrowed everything down to one brutal truth. If I didn't act, he could kill. If I did act, I might kill. Both options weighed the same. Mike broke the silence with a sharp command. "Drop the weapon now!" But Cole didn't move. Instead, he laughed, low and full of contempt. "You won't shoot, Brooks, because if you do, you'll have to face the mirror for the rest of your life." That's when I understood. The fight wasn't with him. It was with myself. I could feel my heart imploding, each beat louder than the last. I was standing at an invisible fork in the road, two paths leading to completely different places, but both dangerous. Then it all happened in seconds. Cole shifted sideways, aiming his gun not at me but at the door where Ethan was. His target was clear. And in that instant, instinct overtook thought. I moved. 2 shots, fast, aimed for his shoulder and the arm holding the gun. The sound exploded in the room, and his body slammed against the wall, the weapon clattering to the floor. I closed the distance in 2 strides, kicking the gun out of reach and grabbing him by the collar. Even wounded, his eyes still held that infuriating glint. I could end him right here. All it would take was one move, just one. But then behind me, I heard Ethan's trembling voice. "Uncle, please." That sound yanked me back like a lifeline. It was as if, all at once, the rage hit a wall. I shoved Cole away and, in an automatic motion, cuffed him hard. He laughed again, but this time, I could hear something else in it. Maybe frustration, maybe even respect. I stood over him, breathing hard, staring at the man who had pushed me to the very edge. I'd come close, too close, to the abyss, and by a thread, I'd chosen not to jump. But now I knew just how easy it would be to take that final step. The sound of the gunshots was still echoing in my head when the room fell into an almost unreal silence, broken only by the faint hiss of the radio on my shoulder and the distant creak of a door swaying in the wind. Cole lay on the floor, cuffed, blood streaming from the wounds in his shoulder and arm where my bullets had hit. Even injured, his expression carried an almost insulting arrogance, as if somehow he'd won. Mike rushed in from the side, checking me over before his eyes swept the scene, from me to Cole, and finally to the door of the room. Without waiting for an answer, he moved toward it, breaking the lock with a sharp kick and stepping inside. Moments later, he returned with Ethan, who limped toward me, his hands still tied. My nephew looked smaller than I remembered, his face pale, his eyes filled with fear and confusion. When he saw me, Ethan hesitated as if he didn't know whether to come closer or keep his distance. A strange weight pressed down on my chest, not physical pain, but a mix of shame and relief. I wanted to pull him into an embrace, to tell him it was over, but my hands were still trembling, and I knew he had seen more than he should have. "Scene secure," Mike said into the radio. "Suspect neutralized. Victim rescued. Medical attention required immediately." The words sounded cold, clinical, a far cry from the raw reality of what had just happened. Within minutes, the first units arrived. Red and blue lights began flashing across the street, painting the front of the house in colors that almost mocked the darkness inside. Paramedics rushed in, tending to Ethan first, checking his injuries and cutting away the ropes that had left deep marks on his wrists. Others moved to Cole, stopping the bleeding before securing him to a stretcher. 2 sergeants approached me for an initial account. My voice was steady, but inside, every word felt like a weight. I laid out the sequence as protocol demanded. Entry into the premises, confrontation, shots fired to neutralize the threat. I left out the part that mattered most. That, for one terrifying moment, I had been inches away from losing control completely. Outside, the street was crowded with onlookers. Neighbors whispered, pointed, filmed with their phones. I ignored them all, my eyes fixed on Ethan as he sat in the back of an ambulance, staring at the ground. I knew I'd have to talk to him, find out what had pulled him into Cole's world, but I also knew that conversation couldn't happen right now. Cole was wheeled out, still in cuffs, and shot me one last look. There was no fear in his eyes. If anything, he seemed satisfied, as if he knew he had planted something inside me, a doubt, a fracture in my convictions. Mike stood beside me in silence. He didn't ask any questions, but the look he gave me said enough. He had seen enough to know that my fight that night had been as much with myself as it had been with Cole. "Let's get back to the station," he finally said. "We've got a lot to explain." And we did. But the heaviest part wasn't in the report I'd have to write, nor in the internal investigation that would surely follow because of the shooting. The heaviest part was in me, in knowing that I had truly felt the pull to take justice into my own hands, and that deep down, a part of me still wondered if it wouldn't have been the right thing to do. As I climbed into the cruiser to leave the scene, I caught one last glimpse of the house in the rearview mirror, shrinking with every second. But I knew that no matter how far it got, part of that night would stay lodged inside me forever. The station was quiet when I finished the preliminary report. The sound of the clerk's fingers tapping on a keyboard and the low hum of the air conditioner were the only noises breaking the stillness. But to me, there was a constant ringing in my head, an echo of what had happened hours earlier. Mike had already gone home, and Cole was under guard at the hospital. Ethan, after being cleared by the medics, was waiting in the interview room. I stood outside for a few minutes, looking through the small frosted glass window. He was sitting with his back to me, shoulders slumped, hands clasped together, one leg bouncing nervously. A kid I'd once seen riding his bike down my street now looked like a man carrying a weight he should never have had to bear. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. When the door closed, he lifted his eyes. There was no anger there, but there was no innocence either. It was the look of someone who'd seen too much and who knew he'd made bad choices. "Uncle," he started, but his voice faltered. I sat down across from him, keeping my posture firm, even though my throat was tight. "I need to know why you were there, Ethan." He hesitated, stared at the floor, took a deep breath, and said, "I thought I could make some quick money. My rent was late, and I was behind on my car payments. A friend introduced me to Cole. He said I could do an easy job. Just pick some stuff up and deliver it. I swear I didn't know it would turn into that." I wanted to believe him, to think it was just naivety, but my gut told me there was more to it. Still, I forced calm into my voice. "You understand that with someone like Cole, there's no such thing as an easy job? You walked into the wolf's den thinking he'd let you walk out?" He ran his hands over his face, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with regret. "I thought I could handle it, that it would only be for a little while, but before I knew it, I owed more than I could pay. He used me to send messages to other guys. Today he called me over to settle the score." The silence after that weighed a ton. I could have used the moment to tear into him, to unload years of frustration and anger. But looking at him, I realized something. I was seeing a younger version of myself, a man who thought he was in control, who underestimated how quickly life could drag him to the wrong side of the line. I leaned forward. "Do you realize how close you came to dying today?" I stopped, swallowing the words before they came out. It wasn't the time to confess the battle I'd fought inside my own head. I risked my life to pull you out of there, not just because you're family, but because I still believe we can have second chances. But Ethan, this was your last one. He met my eyes, and for a moment I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Respect. Not for the badge, but for the man speaking to him without yelling, without breaking, but making sure every word landed with weight. "I know, Uncle. I screwed up. But I don't want to be like them. Help me get out of this. That hit deep. Maybe because, deep down, I was asking the same thing of myself. Help me not become something I'm not. I placed a hand on his shoulder. You're going to get out, but it's going to hurt and it's going to be hard. And I'll be there to make sure you see it through. In that moment, I understood the conversation wasn't just about him. It was about both of us. About holding on to what was left of what's right before the darkness pulled us under. And somehow, that gave me the strength to believe there was still a way back. That night ended, but it stayed etched into me like an invisible scar. In the days that followed, I went back to the routine of reports, statements, and internal procedures, but nothing felt the same. I walked the station halls with the same posture as always, yet inside, I carried a silent weight. The image of that room where I faced Cole, of the door behind which Ethan was trapped, and above all of that moment when I almost gave in to rage, it all came back like a sudden tide. Before, I used to believe my greatest strength as a cop was discipline. I thought my self-control was unshakable, that I could face any provocation without losing my head. But that night proved me wrong. I discovered that in certain circumstances, the line between justice and vengeance is so thin you can cross it without realizing, and by the time you do, you're already on the other side. Part of me felt ashamed of that. Ashamed to know that if it hadn't been for Ethan's voice in that moment, I might have done something that would have erased all the years of honest work behind me. But another part felt proud that I had managed to stop. That's when I understood. Maybe true strength isn't in never feeling the temptation, but in recognizing when it's about to consume you and resisting it. In the days after, I began to look at things differently. I started paying more attention to my colleagues, to the expressions they wore after tough calls. I noticed that many of them carried the same tired look I had seen in my own mirror that night, the look of someone who stood on the edge. I realized the badge doesn't make us immune to hate, frustration, or the urge to take justice into our own hands. It just puts us in a position where we have to fight those impulses every single day. I also began rethinking my relationship with Ethan. Before, I saw him as a kid who needed to follow my rules, learn from my example, and stay away from the mistakes I knew too well. Now, I saw him as someone who, despite his youth, had already felt the weight of bad choices. And maybe that experience was exactly the turning point he needed to change. We talked a few times afterward, not as a cop and a suspect, but as an uncle and a nephew. I told him life is full of lines, some visible, some invisible, and every step we take either brings us closer to them or farther away. The hardest part isn't spotting where the line is, but having the courage to stop before you cross it, even when everything inside you is screaming to push forward. In the end, I realized that night didn't change me just because of the danger, but because it showed me I'm not invulnerable, and admitting that vulnerability doesn't make me weak, it makes me human. As painful as it was, that awareness brought me back to the job, with a renewed sense of humility. Now, I face each call knowing that at any moment, I could find myself in another situation where anger and duty blur together, and in those moments, the decision I make will define not only the fate of the people involved, but my own. Maybe that's the greatest lesson from that night. True justice only exists when you can hold back the hand that wants to pull the trigger, even when your heart is begging you to shoot. And holding that hand day after day is the battle that never ends. The official incident report was cold, technical, almost surgical. Suspect shot during armed confrontation. Victim rescued with minor injuries. Arrest carried out with no fatalities. A clean narrative, leaving no room for the shadows that truly filled that night. There was no mention of the tension that almost made me cross the line, nor of the weight of seeing my own nephew at the center of the chaos. That's how the system works. The emotional truth stays locked inside, those who lived it, while the paper records only what can be filed away. Cole was taken to the hospital under guard, then transferred to the state penitentiary. The wounds to his shoulder and arm weren't serious, but they were enough to keep him out of action for a while. Still, I knew he wasn't the kind of man to give up. Even behind bars, it felt like that provoking stare of his was still on me, a reminder that the story between us wasn't over. Ethan was placed under temporary protective custody while the investigative unit determined the extent of his involvement with Cole. His statement matched some of the evidence, and it became clear that while he had made a serious mistake getting involved in that world, he hadn't taken part in the heavier crimes. The DA's office decided to treat him as a key witness, which meant he'd remain under watch and under protection from possible retaliation. At the station, the aftermath was quiet but noticeable. A few colleagues clapped me on the shoulder, saying I'd done a good job. Others avoided the subject altogether, maybe because they sensed there were more layers to this story than anyone wanted to discuss. Mike, who'd seen it all up close, didn't ask questions. He knew my battle that night had been as much against myself as it was against Cole. The days that followed were a marathon of procedures. Formal interrogations, reviewing body cam footage, meetings with the DA's office. Every time I watched the videos from that night, I could see the moment I almost lost control. It wasn't obvious to an outsider, but I knew exactly what was running through my mind at that instant. And each replay was like looking at a distorted reflection of myself. When the case was finally closed in the system, I felt a partial relief. Officially, it was over. But inside, it was just the beginning of a quiet reckoning. I had to live with the questions no one asked me, but that kept echoing in my head. What would have happened if I had given in? Would it really have been justice, or just vengeance wearing a different mask? The night the case was officially archived, I sat alone in my apartment. I set my gun on the table and stared at it for a long time. Not as a tool of my trade, but as a symbol of everything it represented: protection, authority, and the temptation to use power beyond the limits of the law. I knew that from now on, every call could bring me back to that moment, as a silent test. Ethan, now out of immediate danger, began a rehabilitation and monitoring program. He sent me a short message. "Thanks for not giving up on me." I didn't respond right away, because I knew that gratitude wasn't just for pulling him out physically. It was also for something he might not realize yet. That night, I didn't give up on myself either. Closing the incident on paper was easy. Closing what it had stirred inside me, I knew that would take much longer. Maybe it would never end, but somehow I was willing to carry that weight. Because in the end, that's what the badge demands. Not just facing the danger out there, but fighting every day against the battles no one sees, the ones that happen inside. Some nights, I still wake up hearing that voice. "Come on, Brooks. Show me you're just like me." No matter how much time has passed since that night, Cole's words still find me in the silence, as if he's sitting there in the dark, waiting to see if I finally gave in. It's strange how it's not the gunshots, the blood, or the chaos that haunt me the most, but that single moment when I stood one step away from becoming someone I swore I'd never be. For most of my life, I believed being a cop was about arresting criminals, saving lives, and keeping order. But I've learned there's something deeper and far more dangerous in this job: keeping yourself intact. The law is a shield, but it's a heavy one, and every day you carry it is a fight not to drop it and pick up the sword on the other side. That night, I almost dropped the shield. I almost convinced myself that my anger was justified, that my actions would be for the greater good. And that's where the real danger lies, because once you start shaping justice to fit your pain, you stop serving the law and start serving yourself. And at that point, no matter what uniform you're wearing, you've already crossed the line. When I look at Ethan now, months later, I see a kid who isn't the same as before. That reckless spark in his eyes has been replaced by something harder, more aware. He still carries the marks of that night, but he also carries the chance to start over. And in a way, that reminds me that both of us were saved. Not just physically, but from something that could have changed us forever. People often ask how we keep our sanity in this line of work. The truth is, there's no simple answer. Every call, every face, every choice leaves you a little different than you were before. And in the end, you have to decide whether you'll let it harden you until you no longer recognize yourself, or fight to protect the sliver of humanity you have left. I don't romanticize what I do anymore. I know I'm not invincible. I know the anger is still there somewhere, waiting for the right moment to try to take over again. But when I think about that moment now, I remember it wasn't the law, the training, or the gun that stopped me from crossing the line. It was a voice. The voice of someone who needed me to stay on the right side, even when everything in me screamed to go the other way. Maybe that's the real lesson. We all need something, or someone, to remind us who we are when we're about to forget. For some, it's a code of honor. For others, it's faith. For me, that night, it was Ethan's voice. I don't know if I'll have the same strength when I'm tested again, but I know I'll keep trying. Because in the end, it's not what you do on the easy days that defines who you are. It's what you choose to do when you're staring into the abyss. And for anyone who thinks being a cop is just about facing danger on the streets, here's a warning. The hardest danger to face is the one that lives inside you. If you made it this far and this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, at what moment did you think I was going to cross the line? I want to know if, in my place, your choice would have been different.